Last week at the agenda saw our Mental Health Matters series of programs, from raising resilient children to examining our collective angst. We brought you evocative commentary, stories, and research both on air and online. And with that, have a look at some of what we've done.
Growing up in Winnipeg, there's a large population of Aboriginal people there. It's hard to see Native people sleeping on the streets, and knowing from the past that there is a cycle that happens, and wondering if you're going to get caught up in it or not.
Well, I think what's really well documented is the plight of a lot of these First Nations, as you mentioned. I mean, those numbers are just atrocious. But over half of the communities in Nan Territory had either no suicides in the last 8 years or only one suicide in the last 8 years. And the work that we tried to do with the Anishinaabe-Aski Nation, we had heard about the statistics. The Chiefs in Assembly said we got to do something about this. They dedicated 10 years to youth leadership development. And for that 10 years, and even since then, I think it's been about 13 years, we've actually tried really, really hard as a youth council to bring the youth voice forward and try to give some of the narrative that shows the other side of it. So we recognize that there are so many needs in these communities, and we tried to provide a voice for the young people that were coming from those communities. But we also wanted to showcase that, the Indigenous youth coming from these communities are actually trying really hard, and that a lot of times what they really need is the support and the capacity to just complete their visions that they have, because they have incredible ideas and hope and really want to move their communities forward for themselves, for their peers, for their brothers and sisters, and for their children a lot of times. But that capacity and that support really is lacking in a lot of times.
Well, we have one of those young Ontario voices here right now. You're chair of the Ontario Youth Council, you not, Sasha?
I'm actually just a member of the Ontario Youth Council.
I'll make you the chairman. What the heck? I'll make the chair. Do you have any theories as to why in some communities these suicide rates are off the charts and in other it's just not a factor at all?
There is no real explanation as far as I'm concerned to say the haves from the have-not communities. I think each and every one of us have been touched by suicide in some way, shape, or form. Even if it is a community that has had 0 attempts, they're usually neighboring with a community or share relatives with a community who has gone through it. So it's something that reaches out and impacts all Aboriginal people to a larger degree than the average Canadian citizen. But I noticed, I've talked with a lot of young people, and a lot of them, that the communities that aren't experiencing these issues as profoundly as some others, they make reference to the involvement that they've had in their communities or the inclusion. Chief and Council has gone out of their way to make sure that the young voices are heard in the community and they're part of the plans going forward.
Chris, let me follow up with you. And again, do you have any theories as to why some communities would be overrun by suicide, just proportionately speaking, and others it's not a factor at all?
Well, we've been studying that in British Columbia and now in Manitoba, and asking what is it that's true about those communities where the suicide rates are low or 0. And what we've discovered is that communities that have enjoyed success in holding on to their cultural past and enjoyed success in controlling their own collective futures, those are the ones with the lower suicide rates. So if you look at community control over education or health services or police and fire services, suicide rates are lower in communities that control those things. Suicide rates are lower in communities that have built buildings for cultural purposes. So you could have cultural events in the school gymnasium or the church basement, but it says something about a community that it's important enough to us to build this building for which to hold ceremonial purposes. And suicide rates are lower in those communities. So I think that tells you something useful. I mean, I think it's maybe more useful than pointing out all the communities that have high suicide rates.
What do you infer from all of those numbers?
Well, I think both of my fellow panelists bring up issues where there's, it's not just symptoms of mental illness that are the difficulties in these communities. It's the broader sort of makeup of the communities and how well the youth participate in the vitality of that community. And
sounds like mental illness is a result of rather than the cause of. You know what I'm saying? It comes as a result of all of the things that are not there.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I think there's, there's some etiological reasons too why people develop mental illness. But I think really what we're partly talking about is the young people being able to form a healthy sense of identity. That's the thing that I think I see the most, is that how do you envision yourself moving forward into the future? How do you actually do that?
There were times when I really did want to go out and go to a bar and watch sports on the tube with my friends, but even just a social gathering with people I've known since high school, sometimes I couldn't face it. I wanted to see them, but at the same time, I just didn't want them to see me. I didn't want them to see me the way I was. I was ashamed of it. Every single sentence that I spoke, I questioned whether I had put it correctly, whether I had sounded manic, whether I had sounded anything. I was a bundle of nerves wrapped up in self-consciousness.
Daniel, what does your mom do for a living?
My mom is a psychotherapist who specializes in anxiety.
We run into these kind of ironies all the time when we're doing these programs, but was
I
that
don't
a
think
help
this is
or
an irony. This is the very opposite, probably.
Well, was that a help or a hindrance to getting solutions for you?
Well, it was both in that it caused the problem and then helped me to overcome it. I mean, my mother, and this is not giving anything away since it's in the book, my mother became a therapist who specializes in anxiety disorders because she had suffered from anxiety for years, and worse than I ever have, I think, hearing her talk about it. She had crippling panic attacks almost every day for decades.
So do they think that you inherited this from her?
I don't really know. I mean, it's not like there's an obvious genetic marker for anxiety. I'm sure there are markers, but I'm sure it's a combination of genetics, of having a mother who struggled with anxiety, who tried to hide it, who tried to not let it out so that her kids didn't see the anxiety and the panic, but you can't hide it. I mean, you could feel it. You could feel it in the hugs. You can feel it in, the holding of hands. Her worry about me was, to my mind now, excessive.
Do you have siblings?
I have 2 older brothers, yeah.
So you're the baby as well.
I'm the baby as well. Yeah, and it's a family problem.
Well, speaking of which, you were the caregiver, and then what happened?
And then 2009, I had my own issues where I thought for sure I was going to see that white light. I thought that was it. I was never going to see my kids again. I thought I was having a heart attack. I had suffered from panic attacks when I was younger, occasionally, but I think for the most part, I survived. I just blew it off as best as I could, but 2009, my whole world came tumbling down. And I went from, being able to drive the kids to school, being home all by myself, working part-time, and everything just totally diminished under my feet.
Do you know what brought that on?
I'm pretty sure we started trauma therapy with my children, and the first component was the parental component, where you discuss your own past and your own sort of shadows. And I think in divulging all of my past and having that opportunity to finally really address it, that box got open, and boy, oh boy, did it ever come welling out, because everything, I couldn't be left alone any longer. I could barely leave the house most days. My husband had to start working from home. Friends, I couldn't drive to visit friends. Friends had to come see me. It was a year and a half of my life that was, a chunk that was gone.
How are you now?
I'm much better. I'm much better. I fight, for every question. If I ever have a question about what's going on with me, I make sure that I find an answer. I'm really all about healing and healing myself and my children.
You still married?
I am, and you know what, oddly enough, and thankfully enough, our marriage, I know it can go one of 2 ways, right? You can either go the way of totally separating from each other. My husband is my rock, and our marriage got so much stronger because of it, and I think it was largely to do with the fact that I allowed him and wanted him to help.
And how old's your daughter now?
She is 10.
How's she doing?
She is doing amazing. Still has her moments, for sure. We had one of those yesterday. I left the house in the morning and didn't say goodbye to her, and her whole morning and her whole afternoon were completely crippled by that change in routine. But for the large part, the confidence is starting to build each year, each school year. The confidence is starting to build. you know, the relationships and the friendships that she didn't have earlier on are starting to build. And it really is, you know, she's sort of coming into her own, which is amazing.
And how are you doing now?
I'm doing all right. It comes and goes. It hasn't been in that really dark place for a while now. I think mostly just because I haven't allowed it to get that bad. I kind of, as you were saying, just keep a close watch on it, because the consequences of not are terrible. I mean, you know, I have friends, I have family, I have loved ones. I don't want to get to the point where when I'm so anxious, it's like being locked into yourself. It's all you can think about. It's like being stuck in your own head so radically that you can't really love other people. And I do not want that to happen ever again.
We see the youth come in and out of the shelter. Sometimes they come in very distraught, having trust issues, having family breakdown. Being kicked out is traumatizing. Having to sleep on the street on his own is traumatizing. And also dealing with trust issues when it comes to family members. That's traumatizing for a young person.
Kids who are from that stereotypical, happy, stable, two parents in their lives, both contributing sort of equally to raising of the children, are they more likely to develop the skills of resiliency we've been talking about here today than kids who grow up not in that situation?
You know, it really varies a lot. I mean, you can see the influence of the culture. It actually tends to have it's fairly equal between, you know, those disadvantaged homes and the more privileged ones. So in terms of some of the trends we're talking about with parenting, say, you know, that everybody gets a trophy and let's increase self-esteem, that's really happened across social classes. But of course, you know, when you come from a more stable middle-class home, you know, you have kind of from attachment theory of this idea of having a secure base, and then the children can explore out from there. So that helps. But then on the flip side, if those types of parents are protecting their kids all the time, they might end up with less resilience. So it could end up equaling out between those two different types of situations.
Carol Dweck, what would you add?
It's not the amount of adversity, it's how parents teach their children to interpret the adversity. Research shows that even kids who have come from violent homes or have endured abuse themselves, it's the ones that take it on and blame themselves that are showing a lot of the bad outcomes. If kids learn positive, can't always be a positive interpretation, but kind of an ego-saving interpretation of adversity, or learn how to work it through. That's what matters. And in everyday middle-class homes, parents need to teach their kids, well, what does it mean when you have a setback? How can you learn from it? How can you go forward more informed? So it's not amount of adversity, it's taking the lessons from it.
That's a good distinction. David, don't you think?
And also the amount of adversity that each individual can cope with. It's really an interaction between that environment and that individual. So when we talk about resilience, I like to think of it as something categorically different than simply learning to cope and grow up in this world. These are kids who are faced with things that under typical circumstances you may fail. It challenges your adaptation.
What are some of the factors that might set back the development of resiliency skills in kids?
Well, you know, as we're talking, we realize, as you can hear your panelists, we're coming from different areas, and we deal with different populations. I'm in private practice as a psychologist, and I'm dealing with a lot of the families that are sort of higher achieving and sometimes a higher economic bracket, and of course that influences the kinds of thinking I do around this question.
But the fact that they've got money doesn't mean they don't run into these issues as we go along.
Well, not exactly.
Yeah.
And in fact, it really is a bit of an epidemic in North America. We have children struggling to take on the adversity of the world. And from emotional regulation terms, what that means is children are having a hard time being anxious in an adaptive way. Anxiety is a really important human emotion. It's an adaptive emotion at best. It's when our brain says, uh-oh, stuff needs to be done here, better get busy. That's sort of the fight response. We call it ready to respond. But we have more and more childhood brains that are all jacked up on reality right now. And either it's like, oh my God, here comes my, and I get up to panicky levels, and I'm so focused on exams that I function almost at a level of panic. Or a lot of kids are saying, screw that. And they opt out, and they head to the basement, to Call of Duty and the bong, to alternative realities where there's no anxiety at all. So we have more and more kids who either have way too high levels of anxiety, and we have to medicate them, or not enough. And what we don't have is enough kids who are just used to roughing it up in reality, finding their own way, and ending up with a relationship towards the big world in which could be called playful but wary.
And you can see all of those programs and web-exclusive vignettes in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, also at tvo.org/Mental Health Matters.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.